Bumpy Johnson got a call in the middle of the night. His sister's name, a hospital, and a voice on the other end that didn't need to say much more. Chapter 1. The Call. The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning. Bumpy Johnson didn't sleep heavy, never had. In Harlem, in his line of work, in the life he built with his own hands, you learn to keep one ear open. Always. But this ring was different. It cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and immediate. The kind of sound that doesn't bring good news. The kind that makes your chest tighten before you even pick up. He reached for the receiver in the dark. Didn't turn on the light. Didn't need to. His voice came out low, controlled. Yeah. The voice on the other end was a nurse, professional, clipped. But underneath it, something else. Something careful. Mr. Johnson? No, this is Harlem Hospital. It's about your sister. 3 seconds of silence. Bumpy didn't ask if she was alive. Didn't ask what happened. Not yet. He just listened. The nurse gave him the room number, told him she was stable, told him he should come when he could. When he could. As if there was a choice. He hung up without saying another word. The apartment was quiet. His wife stirred in the next room but didn't wake. Bumpy stood in the dark for a moment, still holding the phone. His jaw was tight. His breathing was slow, deliberate, the way it always was when something inside him started to shift. He set the receiver down gently, no slam, no noise. Then he got dressed. The streets of Harlem at 3 in the morning belonged to a different world. The neon signs still buzzed, but softer now. The club music had faded. A few stragglers wandered home. A few working girls leaned in doorways. A few corner boys kept watch on their blocks. They all saw Bumpy's car roll past. A black Cadillac, clean lines, no flash. It moved through the streets like a shadow, slow and sure. People noticed. They always did. But no one flagged him down. No one called out. They knew better. Bumpy's hands rested on the wheel, steady. His face gave nothing away. But inside, beneath the calm, something cold and sharp was beginning to take shape. His sister. She wasn't in the game. Never had been. She worked at a church on 135th, helped run a youth program, kept her head down and her life clean. She was the part of his family that stayed untouched by the streets, the part he made sure stayed that way. And now she was in a hospital. At 3 in the morning. Then the city blurred past him. Streetlights, shadows, the occasional car. But Bumpy didn't see any of it. His mind was already ahead, already in that hospital room, already putting pieces together before he even knew what the picture was. He didn't speed, didn't run lights. There was no panic in his movements, no rush, because panic was weakness, and weakness got you killed. Harlem Hospital sat on Lenox Avenue like a worn-down fortress. The building had seen everything. Gunshot wounds, overdoses, babies born in hallways, men who came in talking and left in silence. It was a place where life and death passed each other in the same elevator. Bumpy parked in front. Didn't bother with visitor parking. Just left the Cadillac where it was and walked through the front doors. The lobby was nearly empty. A security guard glanced up. Eyes then looked away fast. A woman behind the desk started to say something about visiting hours, but the words died in her throat when she saw his face. Bumpy didn't stop. He walked straight to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. His reflection stared back at him in the steel doors. A man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit even at this hour. His eyes were calm. His expression was unreadable, but anyone who knew him would have seen it. The stillness before the storm. The 4th floor was quieter than the lobby. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of disinfectant and old coffee hung in the air. A few nurses moved between rooms, their shoes squeaking on the linoleum. Bumpy found the room number the nurse had given him. He stood outside the door for a moment, didn't knock, didn't announce himself. Just stood there, breathing, centering himself. Then he pushed the door open. His sister was in the bed by the window. Her face was turned away, but he could see the bandages, could see the bruising along her jaw, dark and fresh. Her hands rested on top of the blanket, trembling slightly even in sleep. The nurse from earlier was inside, checking an IV line. She looked up when Bumpy entered. and for a split second, fear flickered across her face. He ignored it, walked straight to the bedside, looked down at his sister. She stirred, eyes opening slowly. When she saw him, something broke in her expression. Not relief, not quite. Something deeper. Shame, maybe, or fear that he'd see her like this. Bumpy. Her voice was barely a whisper. He didn't speak right away, just reached out, slow and careful, and rested his hand on hers. His grip was warm, steady. "I'm here," he said quietly. And in those two words, a promise. The nurse tried to explain, tried to give him the medical rundown. Contusions, possible fracture, trauma. But Bumpy's eyes never left his sister. "Who?" he said. Not a question, a command. His sister's lips trembled. She looked away, tears sliding down her cheeks. I don't know his name. He was outside the church. I was locking up and he..." Her voice broke. Bumpy's hand tightened around hers, just slightly. Enough to ground her. Enough to tell her she didn't have to say more. Not now. He looked up at the nurse. "Anyone else come by? Police?" The nurse hesitated, then shook her head. "They said they'd send someone in the morning." Bumpy's jaw clenched. He nodded once, slow. "Yeah," he said softly. "They always do." He stayed there for another 10 minutes, didn't say much. Just sat beside his sister, holding her hand, letting her know she wasn't alone. But inside, something had already shifted. By the time Bumpy Johnson left that hospital room, he wasn't the same man who'd walked in. He was colder, sharper, and someone in Harlem was about to learn what that meant. Chapter 2. Harlem's Protector. Bumpy Johnson didn't own Harlem. He never claimed to. But if you walked those streets long enough, if you paid attention to the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way certain names got whispered with respect instead of fear, you'd understand. Harlem belonged to itself. And Bumpy was the one who made sure it stayed that way. He'd come up in the 30s, during the Depression, when the neighborhood was a war zone. An Italian mob moving in from downtown, trying to carve up the black community like it was just another piece of real estate. Local gangs tearing each other apart over scraps. Cops who wouldn't protect you, politicians who wouldn't see you. Bumpy learned early that if you wanted to survive, you didn't wait for someone to save you. You saved yourself. But he also learned something else, something rarer. That power without principle was just violence. And violence without purpose burned everything down, including the man who wielded it. So Bumpy built something different. He controlled the numbers rackets, yes. Ran protection, yes. Had men on every corner who'd move when he said move. But he also made sure the elderly got their groceries delivered when snow hit. Made sure kids had a safe route to school. Made sure the predators, the ones who came into Harlem thinking it was easy pickings, learned fast that it wasn't. He was judge and jury on these streets, but he wasn't a tyrant. He was a shield. His sister had been part of that world, the good part, the part Bumpy fought to protect. She worked at Abyssinian Baptist Church on 138th Street. Ran a youth program, helped kids stay off corners. Bumpy controlled. It was an unspoken agreement between them. She'd save the ones she could, and he'd keep the streets stable enough for her to do it. She never asked where his money came from. He never asked her to. But she knew. Everyone knew. And still she loved him. Still called him her brother. Not the myth, not the legend. Just Ellsworth. The boy who used to walk her to school before the world got complicated. That's why this hurt different. Because his sister wasn't in the game. She wasn't a rival's wife, wasn't a witness, wasn't a pawn in some larger move. She was innocent in a way that even Bumpy's world respected. And someone had touched her anyway. By the time the sun came up, Bumpy was back in his apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. He hadn't slept, didn't plan to. He sat in his chair by the window, looking out over the rooftops of Harlem, watching the neighborhood wake up. Fruit vendors setting up on the corners, mothers walking their kids to school, the number runners starting their routes. Normal life, the life he made possible. His wife Mamie came into the room with coffee. She didn't ask questions, didn't need to. She'd seen the look on his face when he came back, and she'd been with him long enough to know what it meant. She set the cup on the table beside him, rested a hand on his shoulder. She gonna be okay? Bumpy nodded once, slowly. Physically, Mamie's hand tightened just a fraction. And the man who did it? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He lifted the coffee, took a slow sip, let the heat settle in his chest. He doesn't know yet, Bumpy said quietly, but he will. Mamie leaned down, kissed the top of his head. Be smart, Ellsworth. He looked up at her, and for just a moment, his expression softened. Always am. An hour later, Bumpy was on the street. Not in the Cadillac this time. On foot, walking through his neighborhood the way he always did. Slow, deliberate, visible. People saw him and nodded. Some spoke. Some just stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. He stopped at a barber shop on 7th Avenue or walked in without announcement. The place went quiet, not tense, just attentive. The barber, an older man named Clayton, wiped his hands on a towel and gestured toward the chair. Mr. Johnson, wasn't expecting you today. Bumpy shook his head. Not here for a cut. He glanced around the room. 3 men getting shaves, 2 more waiting, all of them watching now, trying not to look like they were. Word travels fast in Harlem, Bumpy said, his voice calm, conversational. So, I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to trust it gets where it needs to go. The room was stone silent now. My sister was hurt last night, outside Abyssinian. Man put his hands on her. Did worse. He let that sit in the air for a beat. I'm looking for a name. Description's vague, but someone knows. Someone saw. And I need that person to come forward, quietly, respectfully. He turned toward the door, then paused. I'm not asking the police. I'm asking Harlem. Then he walked out. By noon, 3 people had reached out. One through a runner, one through a bartender, one directly, walking right up to Bumpy on the street, hat in hand, voice low. They all said the same name. Monroe, a man from outside the neighborhood. Came up from Brooklyn a few months back, worked as muscle for a small-time dealer, trying to push weight in Harlem without permission. Cocky, reckless. The kind of man who thought reputation didn't matter because he'd never had to build one. He thought Harlem was easy. He thought no one would care about one woman. He was wrong on both counts. Bumpy stood in the back of a pool hall on Lenox, listening as one of his men, a younger guy named Pete, laid it all out. Monroe's been staying at a rooming house on 142nd. Runs errands for a dealer called Tiny. Tiny's small time, but he's been trying to move in quiet. Uses Monroe for collections, intimidation. Word is, Monroe got drunk 2 nights ago, saw your sister locking up the church, thought, Don't, Bumpy said softly. Pete stopped mid-sentence. Bumpy's eyes were still calm. His voice hadn't risen, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Just tell me where he is. Pete nodded quickly. He'll be at Tiny's spot tonight. 10th Avenue, near the rail yards. They run a card game there Thursdays. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Good work. Pete exhaled, relieved. But Bumpy wasn't done. And Pete? Yeah, Mr. Johnson? No one touches him before I do. Now understand? Yes, sir. And no one talks about this until it's done. Not in the bars, not in the barbershops. This stays quiet. It will. Bumpy clapped him once on the shoulder, then walked out into the afternoon light. He had a name now, and by tomorrow, that name wouldn't matter anymore. Chapter 3. What happened? Thursday night came slow. Bumpy spent the day like he always did, visible, steady, making his rounds. He stopped by the corner store on 135th, talked to the owner about a shipment, checked in with his number runners, made sure collections were smooth, had lunch at a soul food spot on Lenox, where the owner wouldn't let him pay, and he left a 50 anyway. To anyone watching, it was a normal day. But the men who knew him, the ones who'd been with him long enough to read the space between his words, they saw something else. They saw a man moving with purpose, a man who'd already made his decision. Around 7, Bumpy went back to the hospital. He didn't call ahead, just walked in like he had every right to, past the security guard who'd learned not to stop him, past the nurses who nodded and looked away. Up to the fourth floor, down the hall, into his sister's room. She was awake this time, sitting up slightly, staring out the window at the Harlem skyline. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, deep purple along her cheekbone, yellow at the edges. Her lip was split. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, but she was alive, and she was stronger than she looked. When Bumpy walked in, she turned her head slowly. Tried to smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes. "You didn't have to come back so soon." Bumpy pulled a chair up beside her bed, sat down without a word. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. Inside were her favorite candies, lemon drops, the kind she used to get as a kid from the corner store on Lenox. She looked at the bag, and this time the smile was real. Faint, but real. "You remembered." "Always do." She took one, unwrapped it slowly, let it sit on her tongue. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Just sat there in the soft hum of the hospital, the distant beeping of machines, the muffled voices in the hallway. Then she said it. "I don't want you to do something you can't take back, Ellsworth." Bumpy didn't respond right away. He leaned back in the chair, hands folded in his lap, eyes still on her. Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "All of it." She looked away. "You don't need to hear that." "I do." Her jaw trembled. She closed her eyes, took a breath. "I was locking up the church," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was late, maybe 10:30. I'd stayed to finish some paperwork for the youth program. Everyone else had gone home." Bumpy stayed silent, listening. "I heard footsteps behind me, heavy. I thought maybe it was Reverend Charles coming back for something, so I turned around." She paused, swallowed hard. "It wasn't him." "The man was big, not tall, but thick. Smelled like liquor. He smiled at me, but it wasn't friendly. It was wrong. I knew right away something was wrong." Her hands twisted the blanket in her lap. "He asked if I had money. I said no. I told him the church didn't keep cash overnight." He laughed. "Said that wasn't what he wanted." Bumpy's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't interrupt. "I tried to walk past him, told him I needed to go. He grabbed my arm, pulled me back. I screamed, and he hit me, hard, right across the face." Her voice cracked. "I fell, hit the steps, and then he was on top of me, and I couldn't—" "Stop," Bumpy said softly. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face now. "I fought, Ellsworth. I swear I did. But he was too strong, and I couldn't—" "I know." His voice was low, steady, but there was something underneath it now, something cold and sharp. "I know you did." He reached out, took her hand in his. "You don't have to say the rest." She nodded, wiping at her eyes with her free hand. "Someone must have heard me scream. A car came down the street and headlights on. He ran. Just got up and ran. Left me there." Bumpy closed his eyes for a moment, breathed in, breathed out. When he opened them again, his sister was staring at him. "The police came this morning," she said quietly. "Took a statement, said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't care. They wrote it down and left." Bumpy nodded slowly. "They won't find him. I know. But I will." She squeezed his hand tighter. "Ellsworth, he's not worth it. He's not worth what they'll do to you if—" "He put his hands on you," Bumpy said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "That makes him worth everything." He stayed for another hour. Didn't talk much. Just sat with her. Let her know she wasn't alone. When the nurse came in to check her vitals, Bumpy stepped into the hallway, and hands in his pockets, staring at nothing. A doctor passed by, clipboard in hand, glanced at Bumpy, then stopped. "You family?" Bumpy nodded. "Her brother." The doctor hesitated, then spoke carefully. "She's recovering well physically. No internal damage. The fractures will heal, but the trauma, that's going to take longer." "I know." The doctor studied him for a moment, like he wanted to say more. Then he just nodded and walked away. Bumpy stood there in the hallway for a long time, listening to the sounds of the hospital, the beeping machines, the distant conversations, the footsteps echoing down the corridor. His sister's voice played over and over in his head. "He hit me, right across the face. I couldn't fight him off. They said they'd look into it." He thought about all the years he'd spent protecting Harlem, about all the rules he'd enforced, the lines he'd drawn, the men he'd stopped from doing exactly what had been done to his sister. And still, it hadn't been enough. She'd been hurt anyway, on his streets, in his neighborhood. When he walked back into her room, she was asleep again. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. The lemon drops sat on the table beside her bed, half the bag still full. Bumpy stood there for a moment, just watching her. Then he leaned down, kissed her gently on the forehead. "I'll make this right," he whispered. She didn't hear him, but it didn't matter. The promise had already been made. Bumpy left the hospital just after 9. The streets were alive now. Music pouring out of the clubs, people laughing on the corners, cars rolling slow down Lenox Avenue. Harlem at night, vibrant and loud, the way it always was. Hey, but Bumpy didn't see any of it. He walked to his car, got in, and sat behind the wheel for a moment. His hands rested on the steering wheel, steady and sure. Then he started the engine. He had a name. He had a location. And by the end of the night, he'd have justice. Not the kind the police offered, the kind that actually meant something. Chapter 4. The Name. The rail yards on 10th Avenue weren't technically Harlem. They sat on the edge where the neighborhood bled into Hell's Kitchen, where the streets got darker and the buildings got older. It was the kind of place people forgot about. Rusted tracks, abandoned warehouses, the smell of diesel and garbage hanging in the air. Perfect place for men who didn't want to be found. Bumpy pulled up 2 blocks away, killed the engine, and sat in the dark. He wasn't alone. In the car behind him, 2 of his men waited. Pete, the younger one who'd brought him the information, and an older man named James. Quiet, dependable, someone who'd been with Bumpy since the 40s. They knew the job, knew what was expected, but they also knew this one was different. Bumpy stepped out of the Cadillac, buttoned his coat, and walked toward them. They got out when they saw him coming, stood at attention without being told. "The card game's in the back of the warehouse," Pete said, keeping his voice low. "Tiny runs it every Thursday. Usually 6, 7 guys. Monroe's been there the last 3 weeks, regular as clockwork. Security? 1 guy at the door. Local muscle, nothing serious. He'll step aside if he knows what's good for him." Bumpy nodded slowly, then looked at James. "Oh, you armed?" James opened his coat just enough to show the revolver tucked into his waistband. "Always." "Good. But you don't use it unless I say." "Understood." Bumpy turned his gaze toward the warehouse in the distance. A single light flickered above a side door. No other signs of life. Quiet. Isolated. Exactly the kind of place where a man like Monroe would feel safe. "We walk in calm," Bumpy said. "No guns out, no loud voices. We're just there for a conversation. If it goes bad, you follow my lead. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The warehouse smelled like oil and old wood. The guard at the door was exactly what Pete described. A thick-necked man in his 30s, leaning against the doorframe with a cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked up when he saw the 3 of them approaching, and he straightened slightly, then froze when he recognized Bumpy's face. "Mr. Johnson." His voice cracked just a little. Bumpy stopped a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. "Evening." The guard glanced past him at Pete and James, then back at Bumpy. Tiny didn't mention you were coming by tonight?" "He wouldn't have." The guard shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want no trouble, but this is a private game. Tiny's real particular about—" "I'm not here for the game," Bumpy said quietly. "I'm here for Monroe." The name hung in the air. The guard's face went pale. "Monroe? That's right." The guard swallowed hard, looked at the door behind him, then back at Bumpy. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know nothing about—" "You don't have to." Bumpy's voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "You just have to step aside." For a long moment, the guard didn't move. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Loyalty to Tiny, fear of Bumpy. The very real possibility that whatever was about to happen, he didn't want to be in the middle of it. Finally, he stepped to the side. "I wasn't here," he muttered. Bumpy nodded once. Smart man. Inside, the warehouse opened into a wide space, lit by a few hanging bulbs. Wooden crates stacked along the walls. A card table set up in the center, 6 men sitting around it, chips and cash scattered across the felt. Smoke curled up from ashtrays. Bottles of whiskey sat open. The game stopped the second they walked in. All 6 men looked up. A few hands drifted toward waistbands. One man, older and overweight, wearing a too-tight suit, tiny no doubt, stood up slowly. "Bumpy Johnson," Tiny said, trying to sound casual. Failing. "Didn't know you played cards." Bumpy didn't smile. "I don't." His eyes swept the table, landing on each man one by one, reading faces, reading postures. Then he found him. Monroe, sitting on the far side of the table, third seat from the left. Broad-shouldered, thick arms, scar running down the side of his neck. He was younger than Bumpy expected, mid-30s maybe. His shirt was stained. His knuckles were bruised. And when Bumpy's eyes locked on him, Monroe knew. You could see it in his face. The recognition. The fear. "Monroe," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Monroe's jaw tightened. He didn't stand, didn't speak, just stared. "We need to talk." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Tiny glanced between Bumpy and Monroe, clearly doing the math in his head, trying to figure out what this was about and whether he could stop it. "Bumpy," Tiny started carefully, "I don't know what this is, but maybe we can—" "This doesn't concern you," Bumpy said, not looking away from Monroe. "So sit down and stay quiet." Tiny hesitated, then sat. The other men at the table did the same. Monroe still hadn't moved. "Get up," Bumpy said softly. Monroe's eyes darted toward the door, then toward Pete and James, who stood on either side of Bumpy, silent and still. Then back to Bumpy. "I don't know what you think I did. Get up." This time, there was weight behind the words. Not volume. Weight. Monroe stood slowly, hands raised slightly, trying to look non-threatening. "Look, Mr. Johnson, I swear, whatever you heard, it's a misunderstanding. I ain't done nothing." 2 nights ago, Bumpy said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "Abyssinian Baptist Church, 138th Street, you remember that?" Monroe's face went white. I don't—" "You put your hands on a woman. Outside that church. You hurt her. You violated her." The room went dead silent. One of the men at the card table whispered, "Oh, Jesus." Monroe shook his head quickly, desperately. No, man, that wasn't— "That woman," Bumpy continued, stepping closer now, "was my sister." Monroe froze. You could see the moment it hit him. The realization. The understanding of just how badly he'd miscalculated. "Mr. Johnson, I swear, I didn't know. You didn't know." Bumpy's voice was soft now, almost a whisper. "You didn't know she was my sister? So you thought it was fine?" "No, you thought because she was alone, because she was just another woman in Harlem, that no one would care." Monroe's mouth opened, but no words came out. Bumpy stopped a few feet away from him, hands still in his pockets, expression still unreadable. "Let me tell you something, Monroe. Every woman in Harlem is someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone's mother. And the fact that you didn't think about that, the fact that you thought you could walk into my neighborhood and hurt someone without consequence, that tells me everything I need to know about you." Monroe backed up a step, bumped into the chair behind him. "Please, I'm sorry, You're sorry," Bumpy repeated, almost amused. "You hear that, James?" James didn't respond, just stood there, watching. "He's sorry." Bumpy took another step forward. "My sister's in a hospital bed right now. Face swollen, ribs bruised. Can't sleep because every time she closes her eyes, she sees your face. But you're sorry." Monroe's breathing was ragged now, panicked. "I'll leave. I swear to God, I'll leave Harlem tonight. You'll never see me again." "You're right," Bumpy said quietly. He turned to Pete. "Take him outside." Monroe tried to run. Got maybe 3 steps before James moved, fast, efficient, no wasted motion. Grabbed Monroe by the collar, yanked him back, and drove a fist into his ribs. Monroe gasped, crumpled, and James hauled him upright again. Pete grabbed his other arm. Together, they dragged him toward the door. Monroe kicked, twisted, screamed. No, please! I'm sorry!" Bumpy watched him go, his face still calm, still composed. Then he turned back to the card table. Tiny and the other men sat frozen, staring at him. "This game's over," Bumpy said, "and go home." No one argued. They gathered their chips in silence, pocketed their cash, and filed out one by one, heads down, not making eye contact. Tiny was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looked back at Bumpy. He was just muscle, Bumpy? I didn't know. You hired him, Bumpy said. That makes you responsible. So here's what's going to happen. You're done in Harlem, you pack up, you leave, and you don't come back. If I see you on my streets again, we'll have a different kind of conversation. Tiny nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Understood. Then he was gone. The warehouse was empty now. Just Bumpy, standing alone in the flickering light, the smell of whiskey and cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Outside, Monroe's screams had stopped. Bumpy walked to the door, stepped out into the night. Pete and James stood over Monroe, who was on his knees now, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood dripping from his nose. Bumpy looked down at him. Monroe looked up, tears streaming down his face. Please, he whispered. Please, I have a family. So does she, Bumpy said. And then he nodded to James. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. They took Monroe to the river, not the Hudson where the lights from Manhattan reflected off the water and people still walked at night. Somewhere quieter, somewhere the city forgot about. A stretch of abandoned docks near the Harlem River, where the old shipping warehouses stood empty, and the only sound was the water lapping against rotted wood. Monroe didn't fight anymore. He'd gone quiet in the car, slumped between Pete and James in the back seat, breathing hard, eyes wide and glassy. Shock, maybe. Or the dawning realization that begging wasn't going to change what was coming. Bumpy drove in silence. His hands were steady on the wheel. His face was calm. But inside, something had shifted. Something cold and absolute had taken root the moment his sister told him what happened, and now it was guiding every move he made. This wasn't rage. Rage was hot, impulsive, messy. This was justice. They pulled up to the docks just after 11. The area was deserted. A few streetlights still worked, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. The warehouses loomed like tombstones in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence. Bumpy got out first, and stood there for a moment, looking out at the water. The city skyline glittered across the river, oblivious. Life went on over there. People having dinner, catching cabs, laughing in bars. They had no idea what was happening here just a few miles away. They never did. Pete and James dragged Monroe out of the back seat. His legs barely worked. They had to hold him upright. Walk, James said quietly. Monroe stumbled forward, half carried by the two men, toward the edge of the dock. Bumpy followed, hands in his coat pockets, moving slow and deliberate. When they reached the end of the dock, Pete and James forced Monroe to his knees. He swayed there, head hanging, blood dripping from his split lip onto the wooden planks below. Bumpy stopped a few feet away, looked down at him. You know why you're here, Bumpy said. Not a question. A statement. Monroe didn't answer, just knelt there, shaking. I want to hear you say it. Still nothing. Bumpy crouched down, slow, until he was at eye level with Monroe. His voice stayed quiet, almost conversational. Say it. Monroe's breath hitched. He lifted his head slightly, eyes red and wet. I hurt your sister. You did more than hurt her. Monroe's face crumpled. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. Bumpy's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath now. You saw a woman alone. You saw an opportunity. And you took it. That wasn't an accident. That was a choice. Monroe sobbed, the sound raw and broken. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. You keep saying that, Bumpy said softly, like it means something, like it changes what you did. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Monroe flinched, not thinking he was going for a gun. But Bumpy pulled out a photograph instead. A small, worn picture. His sister, younger, smiling, standing outside the church in her Sunday dress. Bumpy had carried it in his wallet for years. He held it up in front of Monroe's face. You see her? Monroe's eyes flicked to the photo, then away, unable to hold the gaze. Look at her, Bumpy commanded, his voice harder now. Monroe looked. That's who you hurt. That's who you terrorized. That's who's lying in a hospital bed right now because of you. Bumpy's jaw tightened. She helps kids stay out of trouble, runs programs, feeds people. She spent her whole life trying to make Harlem better. And you, he stopped himself, took a breath. You decided none of that mattered. Bumpy stood up, slipped the photograph back into his coat, and then turned to face the water. I've been running these streets for 30 years, he said, speaking as much to himself as to Monroe. And I've done things most men wouldn't understand. I've hurt people. I've made decisions that cost lives. But I've always had a line. He turned back around. You don't touch the innocent. You don't prey on the weak. You don't bring your violence to people who aren't in the game. His eyes locked on Monroe. You crossed that line. Monroe's voice came out in a desperate whisper. What do you want me to do? Tell me. I'll do anything. There's nothing you can do, Bumpy said simply. That's the point. He nodded to James. James pulled out his revolver, checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, then stepped forward. Monroe's eyes went wide. He tried to scramble backward. But Pete grabbed him by the shoulders, held him in place. No, please, I'll leave. I'll never come back. I swear on my life. Your life, Bumpy said quietly, doesn't belong to you anymore. Monroe screamed then, a raw animal sound. He thrashed against Pete's grip, but it was useless. James pressed the barrel of the revolver against the back of Monroe's skull, and then Bumpy raised his hand. Wait! James froze, looked at Bumpy, confused. Monroe was sobbing now, hysterical, barely coherent. Bumpy stepped closer, crouched down again right in front of Monroe. Look at me! It took Monroe a moment. His whole body was shaking, his face slick with tears and snot. But eventually his eyes found Bumpy's. I want you to understand something, Bumpy said, his voice soft, almost gentle. This isn't about revenge. It's not about anger. It's about balance. Monroe stared at him, uncomprehending. You created a debt, and debts in Harlem get paid. Bumpy stood, stepped back, looked at James, and nodded. The shot echoed across the water. A single crack, sharp and final, swallowed almost immediately by the night. Monroe's body slumped forward, hitting the dock with a dull thud. For a moment, no one moved. Just the sound of the river, the distant hum of the city, the wind rustling through the empty warehouses. Bumpy stood there, looking down at the body, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away. Get rid of him, he said quietly. Make sure he's not found. Pete and James nodded. They'd done this before. They knew the process. Bumpy walked back toward the car, hands in his pockets, moving with the same calm, some measured pace he always had. Behind him, he heard the splash as Monroe's body hit the water. He didn't look back. By the time Bumpy got back to his apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m. Mamie was still awake, sitting in the living room, with a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She looked up when he walked in, studied his face. It's done? Bumpy nodded. She didn't ask for details. Didn't need to. Your sister? I'll go see her in the morning. Mamie stood, walked over to him, placed a hand on his chest. You okay? Bumpy looked down at her. For the first time that night, something in his expression softened. I will be. She kissed him gently, then stepped back. Get some rest, Ellsworth. He nodded, but they both knew he wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. Bumpy sat by the window again and staring out at Harlem. The streets were quiet now. The clubs had closed. The corner boys had gone home. Just the city, breathing in the dark, alive and sleeping at the same time. He thought about his sister, about the fear in her voice, the bruises on her face. He thought about Monroe, about the way he'd begged, the way he'd screamed, and he felt nothing. No guilt, no satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that what needed to be done had been done. Balance restored. Somewhere in the night, a siren wailed, then faded. Bumpy closed his eyes. In Harlem, he said softly to no one, debts always get paid. Chapter 6. What broke, what stayed. The news didn't break, it whispered. That's how things worked in Harlem. No headlines, no police press conferences, no reporters asking questions. Just words passed quietly in barbershops, sounded on street corners, in the back rooms of clubs where men gathered and spoke in low voices. Monroe was gone. No one asked where, no one needed to, and the name attached to his disappearance, Bumpy Johnson, wasn't spoken with fear. It was spoken with understanding, with respect, with the kind of quiet acknowledgement that comes when justice is served outside the system that was never built to serve you in the first place. Bumpy went back to the hospital Friday morning, walked the same halls, past the same nurses, up to the same fourth-floor room. His sister was sitting up this time, looking stronger. The swelling in her face had gone down slightly. She was eating slow, careful bites of oatmeal. When she saw him, she set the spoon down. Ellsworth. He pulled up the chair, sat beside her bed like he had the day before. No, for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said it, quiet and knowing. It's over, isn't it? Not a question. Bumpy looked at her. Didn't lie, didn't soften it. Yeah. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath. When she opened them again, there were tears, but they weren't from sadness. Something else? Relief, maybe. Or grief for the world they lived in, where this was the only justice available. Did he suffer? Bumpy held her gaze. Not as much as he deserved. She nodded slowly. Looked down at her hands. I don't know how to feel about that. You don't have to feel anything, Bumpy said gently. That's why I did it. So you wouldn't have to carry it. Her lip trembled. But now you do. Bumpy reached out, took her hand in his. I've been carrying things a long time. And one more doesn't change me. She squeezed his hand, tears sliding down her cheeks. I didn't want you to become something you're not because of me. Bumpy's expression softened, just a fraction. I didn't become anything. I've always been this. You've always known that. I know, but I also know there's more to you than there is, he said quietly, because of people like you. Because you remind me why I do what I do. She looked at him, searching his face. And what is that? Protect what matters. They sat together for another hour, talked about small things. Her recovery when she'd be released, what she needed at home. Bumpy promised to have someone clean her apartment, stock her fridge, make sure everything was ready when she got back. She didn't ask about Monroe again, and Bumpy didn't offer. And before he left, she grabbed his hand one more time. Thank you, she whispered. He kissed her forehead. Always. When Bumpy walked out of the hospital, the sun was high and bright. Harlem looked different in the daylight, vibrant, alive, full of motion. Kids running down sidewalks, women with shopping bags, old men playing chess in the park. Normal life. The life he'd killed to protect. He got into his car, but didn't start it right away. Just sat there, hands on the wheel, staring at nothing. Something had shifted inside him that night at the docks. Not broken, but changed. He'd taken lives before. That wasn't new. But this one felt different. Personal. It wasn't business. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't about territory or respect in the abstract. It was about family. And when you crossed that line, when you made it personal, there was no calculation, no negotiation, just consequence. By Saturday, the streets knew, not the details. No one talked specifics, but the message was clear. Bumpy Johnson's sister had been hurt, and the man responsible was gone. That was all anyone needed to hear. In the barbershops, the conversations were careful, respectful. Man did what he had to do. Damn right, you don't touch family. That's why Bumpy's still standing after all these years. He don't play. On the corners, the younger guys, the ones who thought they understood the game, talked louder, tried to sound hard. See? That's real power. You cross the line, you pay. But the older men, the ones who'd lived through wars and seen empires rise and fall, they knew better. It ain't about power, one of them said, leaning against a brick wall, cigarette in hand. It's about principle. Bumpy could have sent anyone to do that. But he went himself. That's the difference. What difference? Means it cost him something. Means he carries it. That's why people respect him. Not because he's ruthless, because he's responsible. Bumpy heard the whispers. He always did. But he didn't acknowledge them. Didn't make speeches, didn't hold court, didn't explain himself. He just kept moving. Sunday he was at church. Not his sister's, but one a few blocks over. Sat in the back pew like he always did, didn't sing, didn't pray out loud. Just listened to the sermon, let the words wash over him. The preacher talked about forgiveness, about grace, about turning the other cheek. Bumpy didn't disagree, but he also knew there were some things forgiveness couldn't fix, some debts that had to be settled in blood. On Monday, a detective came by his apartment. Young guy, white, probably mid-30s. Suit too clean for someone who worked Harlem. He knocked on the door around 10 in the morning, flashed his badge when Bumpy answered. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Detective Halloran. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Bumpy leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, expression neutral. "About?" "A man named Monroe. Theodore Monroe. Went missing last Thursday. Last seen in your neighborhood." "Lot of people in my neighborhood, Detective." "I'm sure, but this man worked for a dealer named Tiny. Tiny says you came by his card game. Says you had words with Monroe." Bumpy didn't blink. "Tiny say what those words were about?" Halloran consulted his notepad. He was vague on that point. "Then I'll be vague too." The detective sighed. Looked up from his notes. "Look, Mr. Johnson, I'm not here to jam you up. I'm just trying to figure out what happened to this guy. Maybe he left town. Maybe. Or maybe someone encouraged him to leave. Permanently." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "You got a body, Detective?" "No." "You got a witness? Evidence? Anything other than Tiny's word, which I'm guessing ain't worth much?" Halloran's jaw tightened. "No." "Then I don't see what we have to talk about." Halloran stared at him for a long moment, clearly frustrated. One of these days, someone's going to build a case that sticks. And when that happens, I'll deal with it then," Bumpy said calmly. "Until then, have a good day, Detective." He closed the door. Stood there for a moment, listening as Halloran's footsteps receded down the hall. And then he went back to his coffee. By the end of the week, Monroe was old news, another name that came and went. Another man who overstepped and paid the price. Life in Harlem moved on. But for Bumpy, something lingered. Not guilt, not regret, but a weariness. He was 53 years old. He'd been doing this for more than half his life. Protecting, enforcing, balancing scales that the law never would. And he was good at it. He'd built something that mattered. But moments like this, standing over a man at the river, pulling the trigger on something that couldn't be undone, reminded him of the cost. Not just to Monroe, to himself. Every life he took, every line he crossed, every decision that fell on his shoulders, it added weight. And that weight never left. 2 weeks later, Bumpy's sister came home from the hospital. And he was there when she walked into her apartment. Had flowers on the table, groceries in the fridge, fresh sheets on the bed. She stood in the doorway, looking around, and started to cry. Not from pain, from gratitude. Bumpy stood back, hands in his pockets, watching her. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "Yeah, I did." She walked over, hugged him tight. He held her gently, careful of her ribs. "I love you, Ellsworth." "I love you too." When she pulled back, she looked up at him, her eyes searching. "Are you okay?" It was the same question Mamie had asked. The same question he'd been asking himself. Bumpy thought about it. Really thought about it. Then he nodded. "I will be." And he meant it. That night, Bumpy stood on his balcony, looking out over Harlem. The city glowed in the dark. Lights in windows, to cars on streets, life continuing in all its messy, complicated beauty. He thought about Monroe, about his sister, about the choices he'd made and the ones still to come. And he realized something. What broke that night at the river wasn't his resolve, wasn't his strength. It was the illusion that he could protect everyone. He couldn't. No matter how much power he had, no matter how many men followed him, no matter how tightly he controlled these streets, he couldn't stop everything. But he could respond. He could make sure that when someone crossed the line, there was consequence. He could make sure that justice, real justice, the kind that mattered to the people who lived here, was served. That's what stayed. Not the violence, not the fear, the principle. A week later, Then Bumpy was walking down Lenox Avenue when a young man approached him. Couldn't have been more than 20. Nervous, respectful, hat in his hands. "Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy stopped, looked at him. "My name's Marcus. I just wanted to say thank you." Bumpy raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "My aunt. She lives near the church. She saw what happened to your sister, and she saw that it got handled." The young man's voice dropped. "She told me that's why she's not afraid to walk home at night. Because she knows someone's watching out." Bumpy studied him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Tell your aunt to stay safe." "I will, and thank you. For real." The young man walked away, and Bumpy continued down the street. He didn't smile, didn't feel proud. But deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, something settled. Because that's what it was all about. Not the legend, not the reputation. The fact that a woman could walk home at night and feel safe. That was the legacy. Years later, people would still tell the story. Not with all the details. Those got lost, smoothed over, turned into myth. But the core remained. Bumpy Johnson's sister was hurt, and the man responsible disappeared. Simple. Clean. Absolute. It became one of those stories that defined who Bumpy was. Not the violence itself, but what it represented. That in Harlem, under his watch, there were rules. And if you broke them, especially if you hurt the innocent, there was no mercy, just consequence. Bumpy Johnson never spoke about that night again. Not to his wife, not to his men, not even to his sister. It was done, buried, closed. But it stayed with him. No, every time he looked at his sister, saw her smile return, saw her walk back into that church and help those kids. He remembered why he did what he did. And every time he stood on his balcony looking out over Harlem, he carried the weight of that choice, not with regret, with responsibility, because that's what it meant to be Bumpy Johnson, to carry the weight so others didn't have to be the shield, the sword, the line between chaos and order, to be the man who, when the world failed, made sure justice, real justice, was served. That's what broke, and that's what stayed.